What happens when cold data meets divine beauty? When the sharpest minds encounter a voice they can't explain? This isn't a story of conversion, it's a story of surrender, of silence, of tears, of the moment a group of elite atheist scientists were brought to their knees by something they couldn't quantify, a child's recitation of the Qur'an. In a secretive neuroscience research facility in Geneva, a group of top scientists had gathered. They were working on something groundbreaking, a project called Neurofaith, a study to understand religious experience from a biological lens. The idea was simple: prove that faith was nothing more than a chemical illusion. Dr. Vincent Hale, a renowned atheist and neurologist, led the team. He believed faith was outdated, a neurological echo of ancient fears. He had no time for stories or miracles, only data and cold truths. For him, everything had a pattern, even prayer. The lab was filled with blinking monitors, EEG machines, and emotion mapping software. They had studied monks, priests, rabbis, even spiritual imposters. But nothing had yet triggered the kind of raw, measurable emotion they were looking for. So when Dr. Noura Malik, a visiting cognitive scientist from Jordan, suggested they include Quranic recitations in their study, Vincent laughed. "Sure," he said. "Let's add fairy tales to the list." They scheduled the session anyway, more out of curiosity than belief. No one expected what came next. Dr. Noura contacted her niece, Layla, an 8-year-old girl known for her gentle, melodic Qur'an recitations in Amman. She wasn't famous, she wasn't a prodigy, but she had something pure in her voice, something untainted by performance. When Layla walked into the lab, clutching her small Qur'an and wearing a soft pink hijab, the room paused. Scientists who usually debated about neural pathways went quiet. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was commanding. Like peace had walked in with sandals. She was asked to sit on a small chair in the center of the monitoring room. Electrodes were placed around her, carefully, respectfully. Noura whispered, "Just recite how you always do, Habibti." Layla nodded, opened her mushaf, and began reciting Surah Ar-Rahman. Her voice floated like silk over marble. Every "Fabi ayyi ala'i rabbikuma tukadhiban" echoed like a question from another world. The room, once a fortress of skepticism, grew still. Eyes turned from monitors to the child. Something was happening. As Layla's voice poured into the room, the monitors began showing irregularities. Vincent leaned in. "What is this?" he muttered. Brainwaves showed deep emotional spikes in real time. Not mild curiosity, awe. Dr. Klaus, the behavior analyst, whispered, "She's activating the same regions we see during major life events: birth, death, extreme beauty, or trauma." But this wasn't trauma. It was something uplifting. A single tear rolled down the cheek of Dr. Ana Lucia, the most stoic of them all. She wiped it quickly. Then another rolled. Then Vincent. He didn't understand it, but his throat tightened like it hadn't in years. The Quranic verses were not just being heard, they were being felt. Beyond language, beyond creed. Layla wasn't trying to preach. She was simply reciting, but her voice was carrying something no machine could measure. And yet, every machine was screaming the same truth: this is not normal. After Layla finished, she smiled shyly and asked, "Did you like it?" No one answered. Some were still crying. Others just nodded, stunned. Vincent couldn't speak. He simply motioned for the technicians to save everything. The next day, the data was reviewed frame by frame. Neural patterns were unlike anything in the database. No music, no poem, no speech had ever triggered such synchrony among so many listeners. There were no suggestive cues, no lyrics, no instruments, just a child's voice and scripture. Still, the charts told a story, a deep wave of spiritual resonance. The data defied every control they had in place. The team tried to reverse engineer it, thinking maybe the tone or frequency or Arabic phonetics were responsible. But when they played the same recording using synthetic voices, the effect disappeared. It wasn't just the sound. It was her innocence, her surrender, and the verses themselves. Vincent couldn't sleep that night. He had faced death before, once in a climbing accident. But this was different. This felt like standing on the edge of something eternal and not understanding why your heart suddenly bowed. He watched the footage again, then again. He slowed it down, paused it. But the same thing kept happening. His pulse raced, his eyes watered. "What is this?" he whispered to himself. He tried to distract himself with work, old logic puzzles, even his favorite atheist forums. But nothing quenched the stirring. In his gut, in his chest, something had cracked. He thought about the line Layla kept repeating. "Which of the favors of your Lord will you deny?" It haunted him. By morning, Vincent was no longer asking if the Qur'an was true. He was asking why he had never listened before. Lanjutkan kisah, the day silence fell when atheist scientists wept hearing a child read the Qur'an. Dari bab 6 hingga bab 10, masing-masing tetap dengan 5 paragraf, bergaya bahasa Inggris yang dramatis, menyentuh, filosofis, dan tetap relate. The next day, the lab didn't buzz like usual. No heated debates, no sarcastic remarks, no keyboard clatter. Just quiet. Not an awkward kind of silence, but reverent. Almost sacred. Vincent walked in with a different aura. He wasn't carrying a laptop or papers, just a single voice recorder. He played back Layla's recitation quietly, letting it fill the room once more. No one objected. Dr. Noura finally broke the silence. This is not just emotion. It's a calling. She looked around at the scientists who had built careers on denying anything unquantifiable. Now, all of them stared at the floor like school kids who just heard truth for the first time. "It's just a child," Klaus said softly. And yet, it felt like heaven was listening through her. For once, the room full of skeptics wasn't trying to explain. They were trying to feel, to accept that maybe, just maybe, there's a frequency to the soul that science hasn't mapped yet. They decided to bring Layla back, not for testing, but for listening. This time, volunteers from the broader university joined, students, professors, even janitors who'd heard rumors. This time, they let her choose the surah. Layla smiled and chose Surah Maryam, the story of Mary and the miraculous birth of Jesus. She wanted to share something that even non-Muslims might feel connected to. As she began, the room didn't just grow quiet. It slowed. Time felt suspended. People who didn't know Arabic cried. One physics professor whispered, "I don't know what she's saying, but my heart does." One of the postgrads, a hardcore rationalist who wore a shirt that said, "In atoms we trust," broke down and left the room midway. Later he said, "I didn't leave because I disagreed. I left because I wasn't ready." This wasn't a study anymore. It had become an encounter. Vincent wrote a report. He titled it, "Unmeasurable Beauty, a Scientific Response to Surah-Induced Emotional States." He detailed every scan, every graph, every anomaly, but he never published it. Why? Because the story had outgrown the data. Numbers couldn't tell what he felt. Charts couldn't explain the tear he shed without knowing why. He realized some truths are meant to be lived, not labeled. Instead, he sent a private copy to his old professor, who once told him, "The closer you get to the edge of the universe, the more it will look like God." That professor called back the next day, sobbing. Other scientists began writing anonymous blog posts. Some admitted they now read the Qur'an in secret, not as believers, but as seekers. And that's how it begins. The journal may never be published, but the event became legend in scientific circles. They called it the Layla phenomenon. Back in Amman, Layla went back to her simple life: school, prayer, helping her mom in the kitchen. She didn't know she had sparked something that shook minds in the heart of European science. When Noura told her what had happened, she just giggled. "I just read Qur'an because I love it, Kala. Allah gave me a voice, I just used it. She never asked for fame or recognition. She didn't have a YouTube channel or social media. Yet her voice crossed borders, cultures, even ideologies, not because it was loud, but because it was sincere. When asked how she felt reciting in front of the scientists, she said, "I wasn't reciting for them. I was reciting for Allah. They just happened to be listening." Sometimes the most powerful dawah doesn't come from scholars, books, or debates, but from a child who doesn't even know she's changing the world. Chapter 10. The day silence became a sign. Months later, one of the scientists, Dr. Ana Lucia, visited Jordan. She found Layla in a masjid courtyard, teaching younger kids to pronounce tajweed properly. Anna sat quietly and listened again. No machines, no wires, just the voice, and again. The tears returned. That night, she sent a voice note to the Geneva team. "I came here looking for answers. I found peace instead. I think I'm ready to believe." Vincent never formally converted, but he started praying, in his own way, in his own words, to the God whose verses melted his arrogance. And to this day, in that lab in Geneva, there's a plaque on the wall that says, "The day silence fell, when truth didn't need to shout." Some verses don't just reach the ears. They bypass the brain, pierce the heart, and speak straight to the soul.